This is a place of contrasts, infused with history but achingly trendy, a backwater with one road in and one road out, cut off by rivers on three sides, yet a key location for civil and military bigwigs since the Norman conquest. Orford is also my place of birth and my childhood playground. It attracts wealthy Londoners, but that's nothing new. Henry II, great-grandson of William the Conqueror, built Orford Castle early in his reign as part of his battle to control local barons who'd grabbed power and built their own castles during a long civil war in England. The castle and its earthworks which surround it were a wonderful playground, with woods to explore and sharp little hills to race old bikes along narrow tracks, and, in my early teens, scaffolding up the 30-metre tower of the castle, providing a challenge for nighttime expeditions up and over the parapet into the dark interior. Henry also built the port on the River Orr, which was to become one of the biggest in England in Tudor times, with a long inlet along the line of what is now Quay Street, and shipbuilding yards for the navy of Henry VIII and Elizabeth. In the 1950s, the river was another magnet for a young boy. Having fast tides carry me out into mid-river as a little boy, to be rescued by an incoming yacht did nothing to deter me, and in those cold and often muddy waters I would swim, borrow abandoned boats to cross to the shingle spit of Orford Ness, and eventually learn to sail. Orford may be a village now, but for centuries it was a town. The first charter came from Henry III and was confirmed by successive sovereigns. The borough of Orford returned 2 members to Parliament from the reign of Edward I until the Reform Act of 1832, by which time it was a rotten borough, with the parliamentary seats sold to the highest bidder by local landowners who were, of course, the only voters. By then, the long shingle spit which separates Orford from the North Sea had grown to a full 10 miles, making entry into the River Orr shallow and ever-changing, at a time when vessels were getting larger and deeper. As a result, the port shrank as the spit grew, finally becoming a backwater. Although sailing barges delivered grain further upriver to the maltings at Snape well into the 1960s, and fishing vessels and yachts still enjoy the tidal estuary. And that shingle spit, a flat and empty strip of wave-formed shingle beaches backed by marshland, which was eventually drained for pasture, took on a new importance, a place where governments could work in relative secrecy on new weapons of war. The Royal Flying Corps tested aircraft and bombs there from 1916 onwards, and Watson Watt developed some of his first radar installations on the Ness, later using Orford Castle as a location. Weapons were tested there during the Second World War, as well as self-sealing fuel tanks, and by this time the entire village, with several miles inland, was under military control with no civil authorities, and large tank depots in the grounds of the nearby Sudburn Hall estate. Now those were my parents' teenage years in the village, with my dad eventually going off as an RAF dispatch rider, eventually travelling across Europe with the invading Allied forces, and my mother learning to plough with a team of horses on a local farm as her part of the war effort. In earlier decades, Dad would have returned to his job as a farm worker, earning a pittance, and Orford would have returned to a farming and fishing village, and, who knows, myself and my brothers would still be regulars at the Jolly Sailor instead of spread across the globe. Instead, Dad ended up working in those curious concrete laboratories on Orford Ness that housed the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment, turning and adjusting nuclear weapons as the scientists tested them by vibrating them heating them and cooling them. And Mum cooked and cleaned for the BBC World Service when they took over a part of the massive building on the Spit called Cobra Mist, an over-the-horizon listening system built by the Americans in the late 1960s to eavesdrop on Russian communications. In fact, as a teenager, I worked as a chain boy with surveyors setting out the enormous fan of aerials. Now that cost millions and closed overnight after a couple of years, with the Americans bringing a ship up the river to take off the most secret and sensitive equipment. See, Orford is a place which gives the impression of permanence, but in reality changes swiftly and continuously. It attracts both officialdom and oddballs. During my childhood, the guru of self-sufficiency, John Seymour, farmed a small holding on the edge of the village, much to the amusement of those who worked on farms for a living. Elsewhere, my mum cleaned a large house for a titled diplomat, and a former MP for a university seat coached me in Latin. Later, 60s film stars took up residence, and the village began to establish a reputation amongst foodies when Richard Pinney established oyster beds in the river, seeding them with Portuguese oysters, and eventually setting up a smokery and a restaurant that to this day bring plaudits and well-heeled customers to its doors. I worked for him one summer, lifting oysters from the muddy riverbed and sitting on the edge of the cleansing pool, picking up the oysters and gulping them down as one of the perks of the job. When I return these days, I find I know more people in the graveyard of the magnificent medieval church than I do on the streets of this lovely place. The cottages where my granny and my aunt and uncle lived side by side are modernised and probably holiday homes, and it seems the invaders from the capital have finally taken over. I know, of course, that Orford couldn't remain unchanged by the world when it played such an important role in it for centuries, from Henry's castle to nuclear weapons testing, from Tudor ships to gourmet restaurants. But I consider myself blessed that I enjoyed a childhood in such a special and exciting place.